access compared to what their requests are given this. Jumping to the 1992 Cable Act, we see the introduction of rate regulation by franchising authorities and the FCC. Again, most of you know that this has had a profound effect on cable operators, and I think it's had a profound effect on the way they approach renewal. So coupled with the introduction of new competition, we are in a different era. I mean, it's not like, I guess, the good old days where things went on. There are new things happening, and you need to understand that. Section 14 of the 1992 Act talks about operators being able to identify different costs of meeting franchise requirements as line items. And there was a question here about that. That is a reality. You will find that in many cases operators will come in and say, well, we can do this, but it's going to be a line item. There are political ramifications to that, but that goes to what's reasonable. If you believe it's reasonable and your franchising authority believes it's reasonable, then I think you have to go from there. On page 2, I've talked somewhat about proposed federal laws which will or may affect PEG access. The first being Section 202 of Senate 652, which was passed 2 weeks ago. Common carrier providers of video service, such as video dial tone, are not subject to franchising right now. And what that means is that there is a potential loss of future revenues to municipalities and access corporations in terms of support, equipment, and things like that. On the other hand, as you can see, there is language. Am I reverberating? There is language in the Act regarding video providers being required to pay fees in lieu of franchise fees, and you can see the language that the provisions are that those fees must be competitively neutral and separately identified in consumer billing. The jury is still out on exactly what that means. Going on. Well, we can talk about that later. Let me try to get through here. It's not totally clear what it means, and part of the problem is we do not see that in the House bill, which I've discussed below that. Section 254 of Senate 652 also limits franchise fees which are paid currently by cable operators. And what that language has done is to say that the 5% cap is from the operation of the cable system to provide, quote, cable services, close quote. Cable services in the 1984 Act are basically defined as video services. So those of you who may be defining what gross revenues are to include data revenues, revenues that may come from a competitive access provider, that's gone. That's gone. So you have a loss of some revenues that are being generated on a cable plant. I think that's problematic. Jumping to House Bill 1555, which is going to be brought to the floor in a week or so, you basically have the same limitation on the definition of franchise fees, number one. And number two, Section 243 also states that common carriers are not required to obtain a franchise. Now, my third point here is the so-called level playing field language. This is something, I don't know if any of you out there have seen it, but in renewal negotiations, cable operators are coming in and saying, look, we will provide these things provided that the municipality agrees to contractual language. And I've given you a couple of examples, and I've tried to take out the name of the operator and the municipality to protect the innocent, which basically says, you can see on page 4, for example, that Cablevision, that's a generic term, proposes that should a non-licensed multi-channel video provider offer service in the town, then the operator will be relieved of those license requirements that impede a level playing field. Well, this is pretty problematic, because if you negotiate a franchise in good faith pursuant to existing law, which is the 84 Act, the 92 Act, and you agree to this language, and as I've indicated in the outline, this language is not required by federal law. It is not in either of the two bills we are currently seeing, that is probably effective. I would not agree to it, frankly, or if you have to negotiate something like this, you should be very, very careful about what you negotiate. I would tell you that in the Cable Act of 1984, Section 625 has existing provisions about modifying a cable license if circumstances change. And if you're going to agree to anything, try to keep that basically pegged, if you will, to current law, not saying that, look, if 9X comes in and they don't have to do something, then you don't have to do it either. I mean, why would you do that? I mean, that to me is an invitation to basically relieving the operator of all of those things that they're agreeing to. And while I understand the operator's point of view, I think the municipal and the access organization point of view is, look, all of these changes are coming from Congress, and Congress should be the one, if anybody, to level the playing field. You should not come to the municipality and say, you, Mr. Mayor, or somebody else, are responsible for leveling the playing field. So again, there's nothing in federal law requiring this. There's nothing, on the other hand, that would prevent you from negotiating it. I think given the times and the tenor of what's going on, it may not be unreasonable to try to come to some accommodation, but you need to be very, very careful of this language, because it's really a loaded gun, and you need to think about it, and you need to approach it very carefully. Finally, on the 5th page, there's just a list of issues that typically are dealt with by municipalities, and as you can see in number 6, for PEG access, typically you would find issues regarding annual funding, equipment grants from the operator, number of access channels, and who will produce programming, because there are certainly operators today who still continue to do both LO programming and access, and there's nothing wrong with that if that's acceptable to the community. And I'm going to stop now, and guess what? The lawyer has finished before his allotted time. It's amazing. How much time did I have left?
I don't know.
22 seconds. No. Okay.
It counts.
Next, Rita's going to talk a little bit about identifying community needs and interest in community education. This particular piece, remember I said one of the reasons you can deny is if the proposal submitted by the operator is inadequate to meet the identified community needs and interests. The whole community ascertainment process and identifying community needs and interests becomes the process the city and the community goes through, becomes a real linchpin, frankly, in what comes out the other end of the franchise renewal process. So Rita's going to share some stuff with us.
I'm going to pretend like I'm Johnny Carson playing Karnak. The answer is community education and identification of community needs and interests. What's the question? To which that is the answer. The question is, how can we, frankly, justify the community's position in negotiations with the operator and kick ass? That's the question. How can you do that? How can you protect your interests? The best way to do that is with a comprehensive needs assessment. And I'm not going to even mince words here. All of us up here are consultants. It is extremely difficult to pull this off on your own. for this reason and this reason alone. Typically, you are staff people, and the operator is extraordinarily adept at getting you in the political process locally because you always appear to be self-serving when you do your own needs assessment. And when you bring in the big guns from outside and have somebody from outside say, this is really important, it all takes on a different look or color, okay? Does that make sense to you? You are putting yourself at risk, in my opinion, if you try to do your own needs assessment. I've worked for government for a long time, and I can tell you that nobody is an expert in their own hometown, no matter how good you are. And the reality is that you are basically experts in your own hometown. You don't have any peers, so therefore you don't have anybody to help support you. So the needs assessment is the single most important thing that you are going to do, in my opinion, as it relates to a franchise renewal. Typically, you will also hear other things mentioned about the needs assessment process. People will also talk about doing a compliance audit, a franchise fee audit, and a technical audit. And those are typically what you would use to define what Sue said earlier. One of the things, were they performing a kind of sort of like it's confession, and we're going to take an accounting of sins. And we're going to record that, and we're going to put a dollar value on it and say, basically, you have sinned to the tune of X number of million of dollars, and we'll settle with you for 10 cents on the dollar or whatever. That's what that kind of compliance audit amounts to. But the needs assessment is a different story, because it is the way you document what the community needs. Now, there was a whole workshop this morning that I went to, so I didn't bore those. How many of you went to the needs assessment workshop? Oh, not too many of you. Well, I can't repeat it because those guys were really good. And I look in your book, and I would suggest that you contact those people. Sue also moderated that panel, but you would want to contact Bob Devine, Dirk Koenig, and Susan, what's her, Devine? Disciple. And that's in your book if you would like for additional information on their presentations. Yes? There are also audio tapes available, right, and that would be real helpful to the organization. But let me just go through what the main reasons why, just for your information, why a needs assessment is important. First of all, it documents the city's position. It gives the people who are negotiating, typically your lawyers, a documentation. We filled out X number of questionnaires. We had X number of workshops. We talked to Y number of people. We had this many public hearings. Here's our tapes. Here's our documentations. Here's our written report. This is what this community needs. It's documented. We aren't just making this up. Somebody asked earlier about how do they know that I'm not just making this up. I think this gentleman over here wanted to know. Your needs assessment is what you use to document that you're not just making it up. So your biggest supporter in a needs assessment is typically your city solicitor, because typically he's going to be sitting down at the negotiating table. The thing he's going to want more than anything else is some documentation for his position, because he's also caught in the middle of the shucking and jiving that's going on between the elected officials who are being heavily pressured by the cable operator, being given probably fees for the next election, and they are not going to be, your solicitor is going to need a whole lot of documentation for taking a strong position, okay? The third thing is it's the whole case for what you ask for in the future. Educating the community and identifying your future needs and interests, the way that happens is in this needs assessment process. What should happen in this process, as I think as Sue said, what's her name? Disciple said, is you need to develop an advocacy group. You need to come out of your needs assessment with a group of people who are totally committed, interested, involved, and understand what's at stake for them in this future process. Now, there are a number of methodologies and costs associated with doing a needs assessment, and they vary depending on the size of the community and the sophistication of your existing PEG operation or your government regulatory program or whatever's going on. So we can't give you a flat oh, it should cost you X number of dollars to do this. It depends on where you are and what's going on in your community. But whatever it costs, it is small compared to the long-term loss if you don't do a comprehensive needs assessment. Because in reality, if you don't, you won't be able to really get anywhere in negotiations. You're just going to pretty well have to take whatever the operator offers because you won't be able to defend your position. Number of methodologies people use in the needs assessment process that you will have heard. Focus groups is one of them. Basically, you do those with community leaders and the power brokers in your community, existing PEG access groups, institutional users, government agencies, people who are interested in economic development, Chamber of Commerce, public sector types. All those people should be involved in the needs assessment process in identifying what people are going to be doing in the future. I had an interesting conversation with Michael Vonderhaar, who's here from the Netherlands last night, and he was saying Americans don't have any culture compared to, say, European countries where it seems like their culture is clearer. And I thought, you know what? This focus group process is almost a mandated documentation of the culture in your community, because if there's anything we are in the U.S., it is a community of communities. And each one of us, and who said this morning about differences, I thought it was so important. What we are in each community is a reflection of how well we negotiate our differences within that community. The focus groups are a really good opportunity to bring out what are the characteristics of your community? What is unique to this community? What does this specific community need? And to document that in a way that's clear and that is supported by the number of people that participated. The more people you can participate in that process, the better. Another thing that's typically done in needs assessments are surveys. And surveys are looking at what's there now, not just in cable, but in telephone and competitive access providers and all that stuff, microwave, satellite, you hear FM bandwidth. What does the media look like in your community? It looks at, typically in a survey, you might look at what are the future applications projected for technology and what can existing technology do that's not being done. There is no new technology out there right now, guys. Everything, we've had it for years and years. And the third thing might be questionnaires that people have fill out and document that. And the fourth thing is informational seminars and orientation workshops. Fifth thing is task forces. You would create task forces during your needs assessment. I'm going to go to something that's kind of really weird, and that's going to give you a historical background of what happened in Cincinnati. And the reason I'm giving you this is because, you know how they say history never repeats itself? Or repeats itself, and that's because we never learn from it.
Rita, could you use the mic?
Oh,
They can't hear and they won't get it on tape.
I don't know if it's taped. Okay, I can just drag this thing over here. The city of Cincinnati is located, I'll do it this way. Can everybody see? This won't take long. The city of Cincinnati is located on the Ohio River, and it was the Queen City of the West before Chicago and all those places were developed. And so it became the Queen City of the West, and it was called Porkopolis because they had a lot of pigs and transported a lot of farm products, and they all used barges to do that. So barge and river traffic was very important. What happened was we had the development of cars, and we had trains. And the people who ran the barges up and down the river and ran the ferries back and forth, this is Ohio, and this is Kentucky. Okay, they objected to a proposal to build bridges from Ohio to Kentucky, because they said if you build bridges and people take cars and trucks, we're going to lose business. They were so powerful that they weren't able to stop the actual building of bridges. What they did was they built the bridges finally over these guys' dead body, and if there was a main drag in Cincinnati over here, this is Vine Street, and this is Madison in Kentucky, and they were the two main streets, and they lined up. You could stand at the river on the Ohio side and see the main street on the Kentucky side. They built a bridge in between them, so you couldn't get to them. To this day, when you go to Cincinnati, take a look, and you will see Kentucky just spent hundreds of millions of dollars building ramps so they can connect their main street over to these bridges, because people would get there and say, how do I get to the bridge? You could stand there and walk down to the river and see the bridge, but you couldn't figure out what street to get on it. Okay? Progress is coming, and planning is key to that. You can be dragged into the future with forethought, and that's what the needs assessment gives you, is a planned way to get from where you are to where you want to be, because you all sat down as a group and thought about it. Or you can be dragged kicking and screaming. And the screaming and kicking is going to come from your key power brokers, which is your telephone company, your cable operator, whose best interest it is for you not to do a very good needs assessment. So if you can learn from a lesson, I would say learn from what happened in Cincinnati, and this isn't the only example, there are many all over the United States, of what happens when communities wait and react to what happens, as opposed to being proactive and taking control of your destiny and what's going on. And I'll answer questions later. We'll have Debbie go next.
Next, Debbie's going to zero in on some of the key issues that evolved during franchise renewal and the franchise renewal process.
I'm not a consultant. I am now an employee of Telecommunications, Inc., which is the dark horse, and I'd like to know where you live in the second row.
Bloomington, Indiana.
Bloomington, Indiana. Thank you.
Your big guns have been to our town several times, right?
Pardon me?
Your big guns have been to our town several times to fight late fees.
Well, I'm going to talk to some of our big guns, because it's not appropriate what's happened in your community. It's an interesting thing to watch the transformation of the industry, and I think that the transformation of the industry and of the playing field is going to impact the access movement dramatically, and is impacting today all ongoing renewal discussions. Rate regulation, TCI alone without taking into consideration hiring of accountants and lawyers to facilitate the process. Rolled back rates 17%, which consumers hardly saw, and revenue dropped $300 million. That impacts what we are able to provide in our communities. And our systems are as unique as the people who run them. And it's irritating to hear a story such as that, because it really carries throughout the business, and it impacts how TCI is perceived. The way that I am approaching what my service area is and what I do right now is I serve Idaho, Montana, Utah, Arizona, Southern California, and Hawaii. And the way that I look at, and this is with the blessing of the corporation, the way that I look at the renewal process is based a lot on what my experience was in Portland when I was general manager for Portland Cable Access Television for a number of years. And that is, the operator cannot always be perceived as the enemy. And the way that the system is set up for renewal is that there's informal and there's formal. To protect our rights, we're always going to preserve our rights to conduct a formal process in the event the renewal discussions become extraordinarily adversarial. But our goal as a company is that we're going to have an operator with a system with a general manager, an access corporation hopefully, and whoever is brought in to help with the negotiations is ultimately going to leave, and the community is going to sit there with the franchise for however long the franchise is negotiated. And our premise is, at this point, it's critical that all parties concerned take into consideration all of the different forms of competition that are currently emerging. And if you take a look at the fact that a cable operator pays a franchise fee, and the franchise fee is utilized for use of the city's rights-of-ways, we're obligated to have a franchise, and under that franchise there are certain services that can be required. Are you seeing your local municipalities or even your state regulatory entities require franchises for direct broadcast satellite, for telephony providers, for other multiple video providers that are going to emerge in the community. It's coming. We are seeing it dramatically impact the market and how people are buying entertainment services. And it's very critical from the access perspective that we not put our head in the sand and ignore the competition that is emerging, because it is going to make the available dollars fewer and far fewer. It's just going to reduce the amount of revenue that's available. So as I'm approaching renewal discussions, and when I'm approaching transfer proceedings where renewal discussions may be part of them, number one, we're really looking to try and develop collaborations before it turns into an adversarial relationship, and initiate informal discussions, not only with the municipality, but with the access provider and with whoever else is interested in the provision of cable services into the future. Secondly, it is not only the city that is going to conduct an ascertainment. The operator and we as a business feel as though it is absolutely critical to conduct an ascertainment, because under federal legislation, essentially, as Sue stated, the proposal has to be in response to the needs of the community, and that can only be done through ascertainment. In a number of communities, we are approached to do joint ascertainments, and it is something that we're definitely open to doing. I echo Rita's sentiments regarding how the ascertainment is conducted. Our premise is that if a proceeding kicks into a formal process, which is not what we want, we're going to need an ascertainment done, or a needs assessment done, that is scientifically sound and statistically verifiable. And when we're looking at survey tools, we're looking at surveys that are inclusive of both cable subscribers and non-subscribers. We're looking at focus groups and interviews with community leaders. And I would recommend, as you are looking at the ascertainment process, that you talk to market research firms. You figure out how you can end up with an ascertainment or an assessment that will hold up in a formal hearing and work appropriately. So the relationship of the negotiating parties is very, very critical, and determining what kind of process will be used. In Portland, we ran an informal process in conjunction with an informal in conjunction with the formal process, so that in the event the informal process broke down, the formal process would kick in, and everyone's rights are preserved. The preservation of rights is just a matter of what we need to do in order to protect our interests. We think it's critical for where it's necessary that local communities may not have the expertise internally, and it may be required to hire consultants to come in and assist the community with negotiations. If you feel it's necessary, we encourage you to do it, but from the company's perspective, that is a cost that is to be borne by the community. It is not a cost that the company is going to bear. We feel as though it should be paid out of franchise fees that have been previously paid or that are to be paid in the future. We do not want a franchise to lock in our system design. I cannot emphasize to you enough, under new and renewed franchises, that you'll find operators are going to be progressively more and more resistant to defining what their deployment platform is going to be, because whether you like it or not, technology is changing. And we have communities where a community has stated, you will put in this, and this is the type of amplifier that will go in, and by the time it's being installed, we're installing an obsolete plant in order to stay current. What we want is, we want for the ascertainment to determine what the specific community needs. We want to associate what the cost is with fulfilling those needs, so that the community is aware that when they ask for something, this is what it is going to cost. And if it's up to the community that they are willing to pay the cost for providing that service, then we will determine how to technologically deliver it. And that is what our mandate is as a business. How many centers here, how many centers receive a portion of the franchise fee for operating? I have 2 minutes, and I think that this is one of the most critical issues that is facing the access industry at this point in time, because the bottom line is that, and this is where it creates a very us and them mentality. We feel, based on our interpretation of the law, that we are obligated and can be obligated to provide capital dollars for PEG, but we are under no obligation to provide operating funds. That is not to say that you cannot negotiate it locally with your local operator if they're open to discussing it, but it is not a commitment that we feel compelled, and we have communities where it's not being done. And our main concern is that we see a great value in access, as hard as that may be to believe. As compared to direct broadcast satellite, we are the only provider of entertainment services that carries local programming, and that's not just must-carries with broadcasters, it is also PE&G. Programming that's carried on the system. There is a value to the cable operator for the programming that you all provide. What you're able to negotiate on the local level is really governed by the relationship at the negotiating table. The other thing I will say is, as the future goes forward, we're going to be creating alliances with educational, government, and public access institutions in order to improve and help develop that programming, so that the stuff that we're seeing on the system and that we're carrying on the system is of importance to the community. And when we're looking at collaborations and when we're looking at PEG capital funds, it is not going to be exclusively for the creation of studios and acquisition of cameras. We may want to look at providing the means for PEG funds to buy computers that can go into a library with a ProShare program from Intel on it, so that our citizens can go into a library, sit down at a computer kiosk with a camera aimed at them off of a computer, and trigger on to end up on a channel without having to have a public access studio. So be creative as you formulate what it is that you want in your community, and be prepared to pay for it, because as you questioned, why is all this stuff getting passed through? It's a difference of opinion, but essentially we feel that with the expiration of a franchise, we are starting from the get-go, and generally where we do commit, it's probably going to be passed through to the subscriber.
Okay, thank you. Next, Jean's going to share some strategies for retaining, gaining, and expanding access during renewal.
Give her the mic. Oh.
You want the lights down, Jim?
I think everybody can see it with the lights on. Thanks. Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be with you today. I have to say that for me it's a bit of a look back to come here and talk about renewal. I see some faces who've been involved in access and in this organization for a long time, but it was in 1976 across the river at MIT that the very first NFLCP or Alliance meeting was held. And I have to say that one of our first questions then was, how do we expand access? How do we get access in the franchising process? Now we've come total around, and a lot of those franchises are up for renewal, and that's why you're here. I think the good part about having this organization here, and obviously more expansive than it was at that time by leaps and bounds, is that you can ask each other and learn from what other people have received. And so as you get into this process, remember that doing research is important. And those of you who have been involved in access for a long time know that doing access, Are we okay? Is hard work. The renewal process is long, lengthy, and hard work. If you want to see access expanded or is this better? Okay. If you want to see access expanded, just expect that while you're in the renewal process, you'll put in probably some of your longest hours, almost as long as the startup of an access center. Let me go through with you what I think are some of the key strategies as you go forward. We work for cities around the country. Some have access facilities, some would like to have access facilities, and each community handles it slightly differently. As you go through, always do remember that what has been talked about by many of the other panelists, which is you are in a process that is a formal process under the Cable Act. Your key, I think, and this is just kind of a summary of what the formal process is, but the process itself, whether you go informal or whether you go formal, can involve a community needs assessment and a very strong process. You may, if you go through informal, end up back in the formal, so it's always good to remember that you have to have a community needs assessment process. I think people have already talked about, how important it is. It's also important to remember what was brought up, which is in that process, if community needs are not met, it can be a reason for denial. Now, I say that because I sit across the negotiating table every week with cable operators from around the country, and the one thing they don't want to do is expend money where it won't be used. What you have to show to them is that, in fact, you will have a good application for it, that you have thought about it, that you have planned it. Then, should they not respond in kind, they'll know that you have the option to pursue this. One of the things that Sue asked me to talk about is, what is a good strategy? And one strategy is to be very aware of what the city process is going to be. For example, we did Greensboro, North Carolina, where they have an access operation run by the cable company, but they wanted to see it expanded, and they weren't doing government access, and they had a good educational access, but they'd like to expand that. So when we worked for the city, we set up 3 task forces, one for public, one for education, one for government. And those task forces, along with a community needs assessment and a consumer market survey and an institutional survey, were all a part of their community needs assessment. That also gives a lot of assistance to the city officials and the people who are negotiating. For example, you do your needs assessment, you have public participation. I have to say, I have one community that had like 30 hearings. I mean, so you can go from 1 hearing to 30. But your city process is important. If you can be on the Citizens Advisory Committee, or if you can provide input to your city officials, that's the best thing to do. Another place where you want to particularly be important is in the RFP. The RFP is where the city sets up the requirements. You can require access channels, you can require equipment, you can encourage services. Those are key points and key access points for you to become involved with. After that, what happens is you work on the response. The company provides a response to the RFP, and sometimes that's in the informal process, or you may be just doing it in the formal. At that point, you want to be looking at it, does it meet those requirements? Did they meet what the city required? Now, when you took at requirements, the city wants to do it based on strong needs. For example, we're working in Iowa City now, where it's fairly easy to document needs because they have many community access stations going. The stations are well known by all the city councilors. Kalamazoo is another example. What you're looking at, I think, is talking about what it is you have done. So, for example, if you've got a public hearing, don't expect that people would know necessarily 10 years of your history. Make sure that the 10 years of your history is on the public record. What you need in the future is on the public record. When we worked with Atlanta, I'm going to use that as an example later, we had the local access group put together a proposal on what they think they needed for the next 10 to 15 years. Those types of, concrete needs will help you set up the requirements and help the city set up the requirements, followed by an evaluation of what those requirements are. After the evaluation of the proposal, usually the city goes into negotiations. They have a team that negotiates. The team is important, and it's important that that team knows what the access needs are, because clearly they have many things that they're going to have to look at as they go through it, and they have some competing pieces to look at. As a city negotiator, I can tell you that they're looking for a lot of different results. They're looking for regulatory authority. They're looking for consumer service standards. They want to make sure capacity and subscribers get good pictures, a whole host of things. One of those is access, institutional applications, and future developments. Those are the whole mix of what they're looking at. If you look at the documents today, you may have documents from the 70s or maybe early 80s. They are not as sophisticated as some of the documents that you will see today. And what you will find is that cities have to look at the whole range. So it's very important that as you do your ongoing activity, if you have an access center, that you keep city officials constantly informed of what you're doing, because clearly when it comes down to results, the people who are negotiating it, and finally the people who have to vote on it, which is the council, have got to say that this is a priority. If they do, and if that's how it's handled in the process, then I think you can come up with excellent access results. I think that it is a lot of work. Let me talk a little bit about the results, and I just want to give one big city example, which is Atlanta, which has about 60,000 subscribers. One of which is channel capacity. That's not listed here because we're all sort of used to channel capacity. We put it on first on our list. People are looking at what percent, 10, 15%, so much now, so much in a digital environment. It's time to look ahead in terms of, okay, if we are looking at like HBO, showing different times of our programming. Well, Access has known that for years, but you don't have to do it on one channel. You can do it on several channels. The channel, of course, is very important to the cable operator. It's an expense. Just to provide the capacity is an expense. In order to keep providing is an expense. And of course, the way the Cable Act works with rate regulation, it's an expense to the subscriber as well to have those channels. So I think it's a key area to be sure that you get what you need, have room for expansion, but not be so excessive that it's going to pinch what a subscriber might want to get in the future. Next is initial access. So for Atlanta, in that regard, they basically took 11 channels and then 10% of future capacity. When it came to initial access equipment, they have a very active public access group. They have an active government. They were able to get $1.9 million with no pass-through. What that means is it's a grant from the cable company. When it comes to replacement equipment, an area where people often skimp, I have to say, that is not an area to skimp because it will eventually come forward. They were able to receive $1.4 million with an opener in year 8 and that's with a pass-through, and an opener in year 8 if in fact the council voted that they needed more money, which they know would be seen on the subscriber bills. Companies do consider that a check and balance, of course, because not only is the company concerned about how much is on the bill, but your elected officials are too. So they saw that as a piece. Another area, access services. This is an area where a company can voluntarily offer you services. In Atlanta, they were able to get the $350,000 that they had been getting on an ongoing basis with no change, and an additional $150,000 a year that would be added to the rate base. Origination points. I think all of you are really aware of origination points, how a necessity it is.
2 minutes.
2 minutes. And those are not to be forgotten, especially in a fiber environment when it's much more expensive to originate. It's not like buying a little cable transmission equipment. So that needs to be incorporated into your dollars. Another drops, institutional network. This is an area where I think it is important to go forward. They were able to get about $2.5 million towards their iNet for end user equipment and for the network itself. The key with the iNet, I think, for access people, as well as upstream capacity on the system as a whole, is to think to the future, that in fact you will want to be coming out of the library, you will be wanting to come out of the schools. Greensboro did a lot of documentation on their iNet, and they're going to have an iNet to 43 sites. It is the kind of thing where if you think a little further, and I know that there'll be plenty of future services and future issues regarding access, but if you think what's the next generation, not the media center, and beyond that, just think, how fax came about and how, now we can order lunch with a fax, and before we said no, we couldn't. even think of how to use it. It's the same way with upstream capacity. In conclusion, I wish you luck through the process, and as you go forward, realize that it is possible to have a very good access package if, in fact, it is something that your community prioritizes as a need. Thank you.
Now we're going to now what we're going to do very briefly, and Jean sort of led off with an outcome of a recent franchise renewal process. We're going to share very briefly maybe one or two more outcomes, and then take questions for as long as you want to ask us questions. I think one of the key things with regard to outcomes in places where we've provided assistance to communities and to access facilities and renewal processes is understanding a couple of things. One of the things that is a critical fact that you need to understand, and it's very critical to your outcome, is this. The way the benchmark rate regulation structure is set up, those things that were in place at the time the city started to rate regulate are essentially embedded in that benchmark rate, the rate that's established as the benchmark rate, okay? Thus, if there were access obligations of the cable company at the time that your city started to rate regulate, those obligations, and let's say hypothetically there's a certain amount of money per year for operating dollars that have been provided that had been being provided for access during that time frame, that amount of money is embedded in the existing rate, okay? And there are two very important FCC rate decisions that came down, one in February and one in April, with regard to this, where cable companies challenged a city saying that, gee, these certain things are already embedded on our rates. You can't add that on to the top of the benchmark rate. And in fact, the FCC said the city was correct in interpreting the rule that way. So it's a very important point for those of you who are already receiving operating dollars or certain services to remember. Now, it's something that many cities are not familiar with because it wasn't something that was directly renewal related. It was related to the rate regulation process. But it is directly renewal related when it comes right down to taking a look at the rate issue, which one woman brought up here earlier, is the concern about increasing rates. And that is, if you've got something you've been already getting, okay, that is embedded in your existing rate structure, okay? So if that reduces, technically under the rate regulatory rules, the rates have to also reduce. We'll start, and we'll take, yeah.
By chance know what those February and April decisions specifically, the titles were?
February was one, it was Paragon Cable versus the city, versus Manhattan. And the other one was, no, that was Cincinnati and Time Warner. And the April one was Paragon and Manhattan, and the borough of Manhattan. I've got both opinions with me, but they're up in my room.
Well, the other thing about the Cincinnati one was that was interesting was that there had been a modification of the Cincinnati franchise for noncompliance at the 5-year performance review, which was really done at 7 years. And the company was in serious noncompliance, and they sat down and basically settled for 10 cents on the dollar for what the noncompliance was worth. And the operator then put a community fee pass-through on the subscriber bills for the iNet and the access provision. And that is, so it's really a very strong win on behalf of access and iNets, because of course they had won that franchise based on providing an iNet and access, and they weren't doing it. So it's a real strong, so when they finally started doing it, they passed it through at that time, which was like 7 or 8 years into the franchise and after the passage of the Cable Act, and they just thought they could get by with it. And now that the city's in renewal, they filed that suit and won big time, and it's a real major win.
Yeah, I was going to say, a lot of major companies before that time in individual agreements that we were involved with had agreed to that as well. The key to remember, as we've gone through, is that most operators don't want to set a precedent of rebates, so you have a strong hold there.
And I'd just like to say from the industry perspective that we disagree. And I think it's really important to lay it out that, you know, there are a couple of cases where it's been successful, but again, the adversarial relationship, and as Jean pointed out, There are effective negotiations where you can get operating out of an operator without pass-through.
I also think it's important to say, I don't know, I think I can even speak for the other panelists here, that it is not fair to expect your cable operator to protect the public interest. It is the single most largest mistake that has been done in this country by local governments, that they expect the cable operator to look after the operator's interest and the public interest. It is not possible. Nobody would go through a divorce that was going to be contentious like that and not have a lawyer representing their interests. And that is basically what's happening when you think your operator should benevolently sit back and throw all of this cash out there without you having gone through whatever it is that to justify the fact that this is indeed a public need and a public interest. From the cable operator's perspective, a level playing field is one where they play and you pay. That makes sense. That's kind of like the sports analogy. That's why I hate level playing field in sports as an analogy for really what is business and community and social interests. You have to justify why the public shouldn't pay.
What I'd like to do now is open it up. We have some time here for some questions, so fire away. Yeah, please. Use the mic, please.
Microphone, sir.
Right here. No. We got to get it on tape. Sorry.
Our current cable provider will soon be transferred to another cable provider. Just about the time that happens, we're going to be opening the window for franchise renewal. Any special considerations we should be aware of?
One consideration, of course, is that you have about a 120-day window to act on that transfer. So once you have received the information you need, so you need to keep track of the time frame. If it comes right for renewal, depending on the strength of your transfer provision, you can have some of the most leverage you may ever have. Because obviously, depending on, if you've only got a couple years left or 3 years left, probably if you're right at the window, any operator wants to see that extended who comes in. So you may be able to, if you can do it quick enough or if you're far enough along in your process, to dovetail them.
I'd say the single most important thing at this time is to seriously document noncompliance and the dollar value of it, because it will give you tremendous leverage in negotiations with the operator.
And I would also say, remember that when you're documenting noncompliance, I believe there's a period to cure noncompliance issues. It's not just like you get a list of bad things you've done and the operator doesn't have an opportunity to do it. But also take a look at what's happening with the industry and remember that one transfer may occur, but it could be flipped over very rapidly in an environment where operators are clustering. And again, if you're in an environment where you're communicating with your regulators, you're communicating with your operators, try and figure that stuff out. And insofar as negotiations are concerned, you make sure you get a seat at the negotiating table. In addition to the county, whoever the operator is, see if you can get a seat at that table as well as someone else. It certainly helps.
Let's take
You participate in the process and do much of what has been recommended here as for part of ascertainment. You do documentation where it's worthwhile. You are an informed party. You talk to your regulator, and it's particularly can happen if in the informal process the meetings include members of a public commission so that the meetings are considered to be public meetings. That can be set up and it can happen. And if they're public meetings, then they're open to participation.
Let me just say, if I may, 2 points. If access organizations generally will not be at the table, I think what you need to do is to communicate effectively with the franchising authority through whatever channels you have so that you have effective communication and input. That's the important thing. Remember, transfer is a different process from renewal, and if it is coming right at the 36-month period, I mean, what I would say to you is you've got to look at that and you've got to act appropriately, but don't lose sight of perhaps the more important process, which may in fact be renewal. Because at this point what you're talking about is what your community needs in the future. They are separate processes, and I've had communities that get hung up on that. They get confused. They say we're going to do one thing through the other process, and the federal law tells you what you have to do on transfer. So I think you need to communicate to your community that you need to go through transfer, but not lose sight of perhaps the more important process, which is renewal.
We have a similar situation where Time Warner has just purchased Cablevision, and is the cable company supposed to notify us that they've been bought out? And who are they supposed to notify? I found this out. I guess it's been 2 weeks now, but and it's also it also falls within the 3-year.
Basically, the
informal.
cable company the official, usually they'll informally notify you and officially notify you by submitting their FCC Form 394, which is a form that they have to provide with certain information to the franchising authority.
Yeah, usually the franchising authority.
Yeah, to the franchising authority.
City or town.
Yeah.
I should say, though, you don't want to necessarily rely on negotiations. We have had several of recent transfers where because they're dealing with so many, they overlooked several that should have come before the local body. And if the local body says, don't forget us, then they will. But, granted, some of these are massive, and it is easy for the lawyers to miss somebody. So if, in fact, you think that they should be coming to you for a transfer and they're not, then you need to notify them.
Yeah, and your franchise may also require it. In Massachusetts, we have state regulations which require it. If, in fact, you have a transfer and they either ignore you or forget you, in Massachusetts at least, that is null and void. So you have to look both at the franchise, we now have federal law on it, and you may have state law. They cannot ignore you, and I would go back if they in fact just glossed over it and say, it's null and void.
Yeah.
Okay.
The other thing to remember is you are not a victim or an innocent bystander in this process. Access users at all levels are the single most important constituent in the cable process, even much more so than subscribers who only complain, who can only complain. You are the ones who have the ability to inform. And for you, and your government officials have nobody talking to them if you're not talking to them. There's nobody else talking to them. And you remember, the cable operator is talking to the elected officials, but all they can give them is money. What you guys can give them is votes. And believe me, they're not going to get elected without votes. So you are a very powerful, you have a lot of power, and a lot of times it's not used effectively or because of whatever's going on in the community. And the needs assessment process is a real good way to get that out, flush it out, and end it. And move on into a positive joint venture, consensus-building thing.
Next question, please.
I'm interested to know how much success you all have had in negotiating. Jean, you referred to it as access services packages. The Atlanta example, the $350,000 a year that could be used for operations that was quote-unquote voluntarily negotiated. I'm really curious how frequently you all have been successful in negotiating those kind of packages beyond capital grants.
I would say very successful, but then, people who tend to hire us are governments who are proactive.
And from our perspective as well, just about every place we've done a negotiation in recent years, we've been able to negotiate and come to an agreement with the cable company around a method and dollars and cents for access operations.
Oh, good, that's encouraging.
What's a preferred way, I think, of funding really anymore, don't you, in the future?
Yes.
Yeah.
Hi, can you give me some sort of idea of, on the average, when you go through these negotiations, now maybe there is no average, but how much dollar per subscriber is usually negotiated for access? Is there any sort of round figure that you can give me? That would be an average?
When I do this, I think years ago, people tried to have a per subscriber amount. The problem with that is that it flies in the face of federal law that says you have to base this on what the community needs are. And you have to be very careful, because you will have operators that will come in, they will negotiate with you, and what they're really doing is they're looking at every other community saying, my God, if we do this, we're setting precedent. I don't think, I think it contradicts both the letter and the spirit of the law if there's some magic figure out there, because you may have some communities that don't have great needs. You may have other communities like Atlanta or Boston that have high needs. So I personally would stay away from that, because what it does is you will give yourself over to an operator, and I guess I understand from their point of view saying, we don't want to do this here because we're going to be responsible there. I think you have to go back, you have to look at the needs assessment, what is appropriate for your community.
Next question, and I think we're actually already 5 minutes over, so this will be the last question, but people will, I'm sure, be happy to take one-on-one with you afterwards. Yeah.
I'm interested in the discussion of negotiating operating costs for access inside, separate from, inside, along with the franchise fees. In our city, we give money to public access after it comes to the city, and I guess I'm wanting to know what the advantages are and the disadvantages, particularly the disadvantages of negotiating it separately. I can see the political disadvantage when it's listed on everybody's bill, but already the franchise fee is listed there. Are cities really getting more money in toto, or is it really the same money coming out two different ways?
Okay, I'll take the first crack at it. It certainly depends on how you set it up. Many communities will get the money from the operator and put in money from the franchise fee. For example, one of the strongest cases for, say, Iowa City is they take their whole franchise fee and put it towards access regulation, programming, and that kind of thing. So the more you do that, the more that you show you're a community participant and you're putting your dollars where you're thinking. But usually these dollars are in excess of what would be the 5% franchise fee.
And I think it's also important to realize that the issue of line iteming is a separate piece of all of this, okay? It's not automatic that if you get funds, let's say, over and above the 5% franchise fee, that it's line item, okay? Because the law says it's permissive, not mandatory, okay? It says that the company may line item, not they shall line item, okay? So that issue, in your question, I heard it all kind of tied up, and you've got to kind of look at it as a separate piece of when you look at the big picture of where you're going and what your ascertainment is and what the needs are, and is the city putting money into it. I think also the concept of the partnership. I think Jean's point's well taken, that if the city is putting resources in to support access now, it is really looking at the whole concept of the cable company being a partner in this renewal process. The cable company is getting something too. And we have to remember with local programming that this isn't always a gimme, gimme, gimme mentality here. In fact, as a company, as a cable industry faces perception, real or perceived, competition, real or perceived, the idea is to find things that they deliver that are unique to them. And right now, local programming and access is one of those things, okay? And therefore, it is something it's just another piece to keep in mind, that is something that as one looks at all of the factors that impact franchise renewal, that is a piece. Now I know that I can see the look in your face going.
It seems very naive to me, because we've been threatened by our local people saying, oh, if you ask us for any of these things, of course we're going to put it on the bill. So we got that as an upfront statement from them.
But
the way they talk about access is say, well, that competes with the operator-owned programming. And so we can't give you very much access, many more access channels, because it's competing with the stuff that we want people to watch.
Okay, I think you have to understand something about negotiations and the point they get at sometimes, not always, all right, is that you have a lot of issues in renewal. And most of those issues, there's going to be two different perspectives, the city's perspective and the cable operator's perspective. In some cases, they can be close together, and in other cases, they're going to be far apart. Okay, it is a negotiating process. If it gets adversarial, there are going to be things like, we're just going to add it on the bill and so on and so forth, that are going to come up. And you have to understand that that's just part of what occurs. It doesn't mean it's all true. It doesn't mean it's right. There's black and white, right and wrong. There is some right in it. There's some wrong in some of the things. But the bottom line is, it is a negotiating process. There are two parties. This is a valuable asset that is being negotiated for, i.e. the uses of public streets and rights of way, and therefore it can get, unfortunately, kind of nasty sometimes.
I have a request. Anything else besides Peter?
Yeah, there's this one here. Okay, thank you very much, and if anybody has any questions, we'll take them one-on-one.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sue. Thank you, Sue. Nice to meet you.
Did well. How you doing?